I'm just gonna get a Windows computer, right? So that was the first reaction I got. The second one was like, you know what? Like, Windows computer having a second thoughts. It's a very expensive. The laptops were so expensive. I was like, you know what? I kind of need to figure something out. And boy, it sort of placed me in that radar where yeah. So I think that's kind of the hack I did to position myself enough to sustain my career for this time, being specifically intentional. But you have enough information to make good ideas on like how you can contribute to open source. Same thing goes to language, same thing goes to culture. Because again, like I said, it's a very cultural differences. The way the Western world sees open source is different from the way the global South see open source. It's like very different. So we give you enough resources and support for you to take it and own it and localize.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Goddy.
Open source is interesting.
Claire Dillon.
Great collaboration.
Wayne Starr.
Freedom.
Stephen Wally.
Good engineering.
Austin Bryan.
Community.
Tom Sadler.
Collaboration.
Federico Gonzalez Waite.
Limitless.
Amanda Brock.
The future.
Gregory Kurtzer.
Collaborative.
Michael Dexter.
Freedom.
And Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Hello, everyone. I'm super excited because we are here today with Samson Goddy, and he has a very versatile history in open source. He's been an open source developer, developer advocate, open source program manager, board member, and even the co-founder of Open Source Community Africa. And I'm super excited to dive into all that with him today here. But before we do that, Samson, can you please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in tech, and what do you do currently?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll probably start from the last and then I go to the first question. So right now, my day job, I work at Hedera. So Hedera Hashgraph in full. Basically, it's a blockchain, or in this case, Web3 based organization. So I joined specifically to do open source. So I'm an open source program manager, working to make sure that everything from code down to community involvement, down to developers' experience are all aligned with open source. And then obviously, I'm the co-founder for the Open Source Community Africa, which is an organization that I think has been running now for about 9-ish years now. Basically, the goal is to have a community of people that cares about open source, but at the same time are interested in open source. We kind of serve as a bridge between what I'd say projects and organizations that want to relate to people down here in Africa, but at the same time where we give people opportunity to, like learn more things around open source. But I would say the most thing that sort of got me into open source, as far as the overview is going, is starting from the One Laptop Per Child project. So I was one of depending on how you look at it, I got the computer like way early when I was still in school. So I started contributing, started as a user, which kind of interesting. Like my first personal PC was obviously not running Windows. So that was quite interesting. So I started with that process, and it was a little bit interesting. And then from there, I started contributing to the project. So I was heavily involved with some couple MIT projects way back. And I think that sort of like got me interested in open source in general. And, fast forward to like years and, I'm still working in open source.
you said that your first open source experience was at school. Was that high school or college?
Yeah, junior high school. So yeah, I know in Nigeria. So yeah, it's probably junior high school because there's like yeah. So I started in terms of getting exposed to computer. No, definitely way earlier. I started. I was just kind of a kid. I love like breaking things, I guess, and then so I was still like I kind of got introduced to the world of programming way earlier, but it was just a little bit blurry. It didn't make a lot of sense to me at that point because, of course, I was a kid, like a child. And then when I got into high school, then I got exposed to the One Laptop Per Child project, which people call the EXO machine. It was 100% written in Python. It was some part of it written in Python, and then it was obviously like run by Sugar desktop environment, which was a flavor of the Linux distro. At some point, they eventually got Fedora in, but I think at the beginning stage, it was a very interesting tool. I would say out of frustration and trying to get things to run, that got me involved in programming and that got me excited about open source. I think the first thing I did was when I was trying to run, obviously for people that are in Europe and non-Americans, we call it football, not soccer. Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of football. I love playing games. My first attempt was to try to get a game from the Windows operating system to my computer. Obviously, it didn't work because it's a different operating system, which I learned the hard way. And so trying to understand how that worked got me to figure out. I think it was a kind of an emulator, like a plug-in emulator. I think it was the Wine emulator.
Wine.
Wine. Yeah. So and then trying to do that, then I realized that some dependencies were not going to work because of course the file system was a little bit different. So trying to tinker it around, that sort of got me like curious, and then like that's how my open source journey started. Started writing Python because I eventually created a game which I wrote at the Sugar community. So yeah.
Did you make the game work at the end?
Oh yeah, it did. At school. So for context, it was a very interesting solution. We used to play a lot of online games. Well, sort of, internet was really expensive way back then, especially in the part of the world I was born. So there were some games that I loved that was very heavily based on Flash. I don't know how many people know that these days, was like, when the era of Flash used to be a thing. So yeah, I was heavily spending more time on the computer. Then I realized that, this is something that if you can run online, there's some element of ways to make it run offline. So I kind of tricked it by saving obviously it's not the best open source way, but I just kind of did like a Ctrl S at the first, and then the asset saved on the Windows computer, and it was running locally because of course it's a Flash player, it can run on and offline. So then I was like, since the Adobe Flash player isn't friendly, or in this case, no Adobe package is friendly to Linux in this case, I had to find a workaround. So trying to make some research and realize that there was a Flash player that was based on the GNOME desktop called Ganache Player. And then the Sugar environment was a little bit friendly at that point with GNOME because the Sugar toolkits were based on the GNOME toolkit. So it's like kind of the same structure. And at that point, I already understood how to write apps. So I basically created a Python, should I say more like a container or an emulator that sort of like simulates the experience I was doing with Windows. So I was able to build that. The game started running locally. A lot of people loved it. And then I bundled it, saved it as a file, and then I distributed it on a flash drive within my school. That made it very popular back then. I was like kind of a cool kid, a cool nerd kid. It was quite interesting. And then I realized that, this is interesting. Like this was one of the games that I would say would affect a lot of like kids. And then I went to the Sugar community and say, hey, I don't know if this is the best open source tool in terms of license, because what would I think I was like probably like 12. What would a 12-year-old know about open source license, right? It was a little bit crazy. So I'm pretty sure the license part was garbage. But basically I was able to I think get a GitHub account. No, earlier I got a GitHub account then, and then I was able to host it on GitHub, and then built like a different version of it, and then I hosted it on the Sugar App Store. So basically, every kid that owns the OLPC machines were able to access it. So we're looking at, like, I think at some point it was like over 36,000 downloads, which was at that time for a non-mobile based operating system. That was a lot, and I started getting a lot of requests about fixing bugs and translations. So that was kind of my first introduction to like being a maintainer, right? Which is quite interesting. So I would say everything was just very accidental and trying to, help myself and help my friends. And then, so.
One of the great things about computers is that you don't need much outside resources to make it happen, right? Exactly. And with open source around and all that source code available, there's just a ton of things you can do on your own. When was the first time, or how was your experience when you ran into those struggles with, the application not running on Linux because it was Windows based, and Wine is not the easiest platform to work with, as platforms go for emulating Windows on top of Linux. So did you have much, I expect you're scouring all the various mail lists and so forth to figure out answers, but did you pose questions at that time as well? And did you get responses? And what was that experience like?
Yeah. So first, I think it was a kind of a two experience. So the first one was when I tried it initially, it didn't work. I just like, you know what? I'm just going to get a Windows computer. Right. So that was the first reaction I got. The second one was like, you know what? It's like, Windows computer having a second thoughts. It's a very expensive, laptops were so expensive. I was like, you know what? I kind of need to figure something out. And so first was me trying to understand why that didn't work. So then I realized it was a total different operating system, and not just any Linux distro. It was a very special distro designed for kids and for learning. So very different based, right? So then I started doing research around the project, and then I saw the Sugar Labs community. I think they just recently left MIT Media Lab. Used to be together with OLPC at some point. So then I reached out to the community. I was like, hey, I'm trying to run this, and how do I do it? And so I was like, we don't usually get this use case, right? So that sort of challenged me as a kid, because I always like to get things running. And I spent my whole lunch money on cyber cafes, going to different, internet places and scattering around it. And then, there was no Stack Overflow and the rest, right? So internet was so weird. The resources were so weird. And why that was almost the peak level for Linux desktop to get to the top, there was still less resources, right? It was so ironic, right? It was so interesting. So basically, then I think one thing that got me interested was, I think it was the way Sugar was designed, the current concept of viewing source code on let's say you're in a website, you love this website, just by right clicking, and there's an option, depending on the browser you're using, you can just view source code. So that ideology, the first way, at least I would argue and say the first proper way I've seen that implemented real solid was on the Sugar desktop, because every application, from the user application down to the system application, you could see source code. You could see and you can play with the source code. It was almost as if it was designed for the most crazy kids to do whatever things they want to do. It's when I started relating with the founders, then I realized that it was a research done at MIT to deliberately design it that way for you to go and break things, not gatekeep what you typically would experience right now. So I haven't, till today, I haven't found any Linux distro or Linux-based distro that is that robust, right? That always want to challenge you to do things. So I think when that source code thing started, I started paying attention to how some applications and games were created. And then I realized that, there's this thing called Python. Not Snake, but Python, And then I was like, this is interesting. And at that point in time of my life, I was very good with math. So it was like, okay, this is something I probably want to play with. And then I started learning building 102 Hello World. I think my Hello World was not like, was mostly building Hello Worlds in terms of creating windows, like sample windows, like a button, 2 buttons, 3 buttons. So my Hello World was basically heavily on desktop applications. So by doing so, I then realized that, I could create my own window. I could do a whole lot of things. I could do like some calculations and still has a window. It was like pretty interesting. And then I was out trying to figure out what possible ways I could get our resources. So I would say it was like 20%, 30% resource similarity on the internet, and the remaining 80% was just me like trying my luck. All right. Because when I fixed and got the game rolling, it was the most visited game and most used game in the Sugar Labs community, because it was just, it wasn't something that was supposed to be, right? Especially with licensing. At some point, we had to take it off the Play Store because, like I said, it wasn't properly licensed. It was just a kid playing around things. I mean, thankfully, no one came and sued me. But yeah, so it was very interesting.
Looking into your like career path, it seems like that throughout the whole journey that you've had so far, you always worked in open source communities, so you never really lost that connection. Would you say that was inspired by this first experience of not just the access to the bits and pieces, but also the access to that vibrant community?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of those things are kind of like related to what I do today. Like, but at the same time, it's more like my philosophy in life. I love the fact that I get the opportunity to work with companies, lots that I love. But if I'm not excited about what I'm working on, I don't think I wouldn't just accept any job. That's the way to put it. In the span of my career, I've gotten jobs that pay 2x, 3x more than my salary, and I just say no because I know I'm just going to be frustrated. So anything that want to take me away from the user, the people that depending on how you phrase it as a company. So if you're saying, hey, we want to hire you to be a program manager today, if that gives you opportunity to see the user and talk to the user, then that's on me. Like, that's something that I love doing. I love I love trying to see how my work impact people. At some point, I knew doing that with code was going to be a little bit harder to justify, especially when I'm not working, because it's so easy for a software engineer to progress and leave open source because, in this case, it's not about just writing Python. You could write Python for Meta, for example. You could be doing stuff like Django, right? And it's not exactly, it could be questionable open source or whatever Meta decides to term it or whatever. But in some certain type of career, like let's say like what people say DevRel now, you could still potentially stay within the open source radar, especially if your company that you're working with have some certain level of like developers focus project. So I think that was kind of when I realized that why I still love being an engineer at that point. I kind of need to be in a place where the most primary thing because the whole point of me writing code was to solve some problems that myself and my friends were having. Not because I was trying to change the world. I just wanted to make people happy, right? So that fundamental aspect of my life still stays, even to every type of job I've gotten. Like, I've been very intentional about the things that I take. I've said no to a lot of companies that sometimes if I tell my friends that, hey, I got an offer in this company, I'm like, why didn't you take it? I was like, because I don't care about it, right? So it's like, that's kind of the ideology of life that I do. Anything that is open source, just count me in. Right. So yeah.
And there are a lot of people like that. I meet a lot of people who they like open source, they do open source, they're part of the community, but they're just as happy doing something proprietary. But then there are others that you find that just really gravitate to the way open source works. They like that.
Yeah.
I think Ildiko and I are, and sounds like you as well.
Yeah.
That as part of the job is what makes it kind of interesting and unique and kind of fun.
You were talking about how important it is to you to stay in touch with the people and the community and the ecosystem and the people who are using the things that you work on and the company works on, who you work for. Was it hard to be able to find jobs where you had access to open source and community?
Yeah, I mean, so like being in open source, at least I would say, like I've seen a lot of things changed over a decade. Like interests, everyone is doing like some version of AI now. It's like a lot of things going on. So at first, to be fair, I was gearing up to go to MIT. I mean, it was no brainer. I was working on the project. It was crazy. So that was like my path to go to the US at the beginning stage. But of course, there were things that were very personal to me that that sort of hindered it. But in terms of opportunity and jobs, I didn't realize that it was very US centric. A little bit, there's some aspect of European influence at that point. But I would say like working in open source as a job was very something that you would naturally see within the US, especially with the big companies, right? The idea of working in open source in startups wasn't a thing back then, because of course, the web wasn't that crazy. There were not a lot of interactive web applications enough for startups to be a thing. So the other aspect of open source was very different. It was like, language based, desktop based, some kind of weird thing going on. So it was very, the space I was playing in wasn't the most welcoming space. It was the most niche space, the way to put it. I feel like it was the most experienced, the most people with more opportunity, people that are based in the US. In fact, like Linus himself had to move to the US, to give you that kind of concept, right? It's like, it was very slim. In Africa, that's the worst place you want to be at that point. It's changing now, but to do anything related to open source, I mean, the government used Windows, for crying out loud. Right? The chances of you running into a Linux computer was like crazy. Like even if now, like Linux is powering everything, like no one cares. So it's like it was really, really difficult. So I took it upon myself to remain as independent as I can. So I spent like most of my life contributing to Sugar. I was able to be compensated in some level. Sometimes I take on projects. Sometimes I work on some things. Sometimes I work with some governmental related things that are related to what I was doing. So I was able to find a way around, making some money. And then eventually, and then obviously, like, open source started becoming a word that everyone wants to use, right? And as people started building things and wanted to use developers to build things, that version of open source started kicking in. So I think with your experience that I already had, building community back then, working with community, like just basically the concept around it kind of placed me in a position where like I was kind of like desired. And even at that peak time, it was still very US focused. Like all the jobs, all the opportunity that I get, even at some point, Google, again, still US based. It was very difficult. In fact, even still staying in Nigeria at this point is just me being stubborn because every single time, at some point in my career, I keep saying, oh, okay, like every single time, either my current job or the next job I want to get, I was like, oh, you always go to the US. Why not just stay in the US, right? I mean, that might change in the future. Not sure. But it was very difficult. It wasn't the most desirable role. Like I mentioned, I wasn't the core engineer. I wasn't like writing code to send people to the moon, for example. So it wasn't that type of engineering I was doing. It was more like open source developer kind of a thing, like that sort of thing. So that was kind of like what I was working on. And I think that sort of gave me an ideology. So the way I was able to help myself more was now taking that evangelist opportunity to write, to speak, to relate, to teach, because I used to teach a lot. I even taught some couple universities back home. I've worked for like couple organization, like likes of the UN, like ITU. So and then some governmental folks. So like I was able to do other things that sort of like complement my skills in open source. And then that naturally started putting me in the DevRel radar. Even if I don't like doing the typical DevRel stuff, but it sort of placed me in that radar where I, So I think that's kind of the hack I need to position myself enough to sustain my career for this time, being specifically intentional about the role that I want, while still staying away from where to get the jobs or where the jobs are being created.
That community of 35,000 that you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, and the community in Africa that you're building, what is that like? What is it doing?
Yeah, so the open source community in Africa started. I always start things when I'm confused or frustrated, which is always has been a pattern. But yeah, it's kind of the same actually. This is interesting. I was at Google Summer of Code Mentor Summit, 2017, I think, and I was like, oh, it's happening here. I know like there was a couple of folks that were supposed to come to the Mentor Summit, from Africa and some other part of the world. And I came, was like, oh, okay. And then I was talking to the OSCA team then at Google. I met Chris Dibona from OSCA side, and so a couple other folks there. And I was like, hey, Google has a lot of like GDGs going on. Like, it doesn't look like they talk a lot about open source. It's ironic because Google talk about open source all the time. So what's happening over here? So that conversation started. Initially, I was pitching the idea to Google as something I wanted them to hire me on. It was heading to some direction. And then got to a point where I just like, you know what? I think it makes sense to do this myself. So I co-founded the OSCA community with a friend, Ada Ildiko. She's based in Lagos. We started unofficially in 2017. The goal was just to focus on education. I had experience already with open source. I've been working with some foundations. There were people that were wanting to run meetups, like, for example, like the GitHub Foundation, the Fedora community, the Sugarloaf community, name it, a lot. So it was like supposed to be a bridge to get more users beyond the US to get people in. It was kind of the structure. So that started. There were like a couple events that were being based on that. And we started expanding from different cities in Nigeria to even out of Nigeria at some point. It was like 60-something cities across Africa. And that community started growing and started doing smaller events and started doing programs. And then I was like, oh, like we need to have like an event, like our own kind of like Altis Open / FOSDEM / Open Source Summit, kind of a 3-in-1 vibe, if that makes sense. So we created a conference called the Open Source Festival, and it started in 2020, just right before COVID. Very interesting. So we did the first one. We hosted around 840, 900 people. Got some support from Google. Google sponsored, Microsoft sponsored, literally everyone with OSPO that was within my radar was supportive. It was great. We had like the OSPO team sent some folks down over to Nigeria. It was pretty cool. It was really awesome. A lot of people loved it. In fact, it was kind of one of the conference that, in my opinion, I saw a lot of people started getting remote jobs because companies, for the first time, normally it's like you traveling all the way from Nigeria and going to this conference and meeting these people and potentially talking about opportunity. That was the other way around. They had to fly down to you to see who you are and get to talk to you. So I think that experience kind of opened the eye of some companies. They started hiring. Even Google hired some folks in Nigeria. There were like a couple of people that they hired. It started really well. COVID happened, and then we started growing, and it became thousands of thousands. In fact, the last event we did was last year in June, with like 30,000 people in person. It was pretty interesting. We skipped this year. We're going to do one next year. We're hoping around 3,000 to 5,000 people, hopefully, if we get funding. But yeah, it's always typically spread across, your traditional, like I said, it's a bridge between like an open source summit, FOSDEM, and like all things open kind of vibe all together. So a bridge between multiple tracks, start from like blockchain down to like web and mobile. The talks run simultaneously, so you get to pick and choose who you want to listen to. You don't get forced into a talk, which is great. I always love that because not every time I want to hear how to write an app in JavaScript, like not all the time I want to be hearing that. So like I love my flexibility. So those are the things I brought up. So in general, like it's been there, and now like I use OSCA as a way to work with companies to be more intentional about some things. So great relationship, especially with the likes of GitHub, likes of Google, likes of Microsoft. Pretty great relationship. And then of course like governmental bodies and the rest. Yeah.
Where is the event held, or where has it been held?
The festival always has been in Lagos, Nigeria. Next year, maybe in Lagos, somewhere else. We're not quite sure yet, but the chance is still going to be in Lagos or in a different city in Nigeria. So, but
and time of year, is it always in January, February?
No, June. Yeah, June. It's going to be in June this year. I think second week or so.
If someone got interested to learn more about the event and maybe sponsor it, do you have an event website where people can go, or should they reach out to you?
Yeah, they can reach out to me. I mean, the event website is festival.osca, then Africa. So basically, you're doing like OSC Africa as a word together .org. And then that takes you straight to the festival. So right now, I think you just probably go great with a landing page of a potential date with a become a sponsor, become a speaker. So we typically get like very diverse crowd across the world. We get like speakers across the globe. Same thing with attendees. So pretty neat.
How did the community evolve since you launched it? Like, do you see it changing how people approach tech and open source? Does it have more impact on the side of people being able to find jobs, either because they get in touch with someone who does have a job for them, or just through the opportunity to learn about the projects that they get in touch with?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm gonna be biased. It's something I run, right? So yeah, it's in case. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. What I would say is the intentionality that goes into the community in terms of like how intentional we are in terms of networking. The festival has always been the place where if you're looking for something related to open source, from jobs to short gigs, contract, or just random opportunity, you're going to get it. Over time, I've seen this because it's on Twitter, it's on LinkedIn, so it's not me saying it, is people have gotten opportunities, jobs, networking, even people got married, whatever. It's like at the event, because again, I've seen it. It has always been about the relationship of the audience. Again, it's not a typical conference that you come to listen. You come to learn and you come to relate. and you come to showcase too. That has always been the focus of the festival. So it's really, really big. It's way bigger than me. A lot of people are, it's like, if it was an open source project, this was like a traditional open source software project. It's an open source project, software project. I would say it's that era where I just like, just stay away, because it's running really well. There are people that are making great decisions behind the board. They're really doing really, really great job. In fact, what I do mostly these days is just like making sure that it's sustainable, like the funding and the rest. Those are kind of the thing that I still control. But there are a lot of people doing like great jobs. So, for example, someone that you most likely may have heard about recently, called Roots. She does like chaos project, Chaos Africa. Yeah. So she's a OSCA open source program manager. So she works relatively close to me in terms of like running programs within OSCA and of course the festival. So for example, like last year, she did a lot of great work, making sure that we keep things in place, right? So again, there are like a lot of people like Perry, like really great people, like the co-founder, there's Balaji, they're like really, really great people. It's really, really big. It's a big community right now that I would say if I choose not to contribute to it in like 2 years, I mean, if I manage to get funding and I stop contributing to it, it's gonna be fine, like totally fine, because it's found its ground. It's the people's thing, and that's always been the goal. My plan was just to use my influence from the Western world and get ready, and then just live it, because that's what I do, right? So, and I think it has gotten to that point where it's good.
That's amazing. I love that, and I also love how the primary focus is on like networking and getting people in touch with each other, and also the world at large. Does the community have a particular platform to interact like between events, or are you more focused on in-person and online gatherings?
To be fair, like we try. So one of the ideology that we started was like, we don't want to have our community. We don't want to cultivate any community. Instead, we want to just tap into an existing community. So if you're in the Django community, for example, you don't have to come to our OSCA community, because what is an OSCA community if Django talks about open source either ways? So we just basically complement existing communities. So we do have a community for people that like to be on Discord. That's great. That's not my focus. My focus is just to make sure that any version of community that does amazing work, like we can support you and work with you to make sure that you're more intentional about open source. That has always been the focus of the organization, at least my own version. Maybe they are doing something else, but that's kind of what I care about. But we do have community people. We have community people through events, through meetups. So we have, in terms of our meetup chain, we do have like different meetups across the continent. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we flew about 33 people down, because we did some OSCA internal structure thing happening where we fly in some contributors, in this case, like OSCA organizers, down for them to come and share new ideas on how to make the community program much better, right? It's like a pretty neat initiative. So that's kind of what it is, because we're very intentional about not forcing people's thought process about open source. We give you enough resources, and then you take it, and then you go to your local side and see how relatable it is to what you're doing. So if you're a designer, I'm not going to tell you how to learn how to write code. That's on you, whatever you choose to do with it. But you have enough information to make good ideas on like how you can contribute to open source. Same thing goes to language. Same thing goes to culture. Because again, like I said, it's a very cultural differences. The way the Western world sees open source is different from the way the global South see open source. It's like very different. So we give you enough resources and support for you to take it and own it and localize as much content as you can. That's has always been the focus of OSCA.
So in a way, you're kind of creating a door or an entry point for people to get into open source and find like the software project or community where they have their interest and the like-minded people and just really get into the community and ecosystem. Is that an accurate way to?
Yeah. I mean, some of those things are changing because there are people in OSCA that want to do stuff beyond events, including myself. So we're launching an initiative. We don't have the name yet, but the goal is something that would enable people to be in open source projects, potentially become companies, like open source companies, like what we're typically seeing now in the era of dev tools. So similar to that, that's what we're trying to do with the experience that we have, with the connections that we have. Of course, so that's what we're working on. So we're doing a whole lot of things that is going to support the talent, because of course, like if you see the GitHub Octoverse report year over year, you see that Africa has always been like a very great, important place with open source, especially on code. And we want to do something about it beyond just like, sending a pull request. We want people to see that it could do much, much more than sending a pull request. So
kind of also helping the economy and I don't know, people spinning up startups around open source and projects. Yep.
That's also like it's always going to be like an effect.
Before we depart, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source? Some kind of a fun fact or a hobby, something that you don't mind sharing with people to know about you.
Okay, I have a very unhealthy relationship with cars. So I'm into things like drag racing, and I mean, now I'm saying it to sound very illegal, but yeah. So I love my cars. Those things are things that I really do. So the drive, like those related things. So going to car meeting. So those things I'm very, very excited about. Other than that, I do like other fun stuff. Like surprisingly, I have, for someone with this amount of work going on, like I have a lot of things away from tech that is not related to technology in any front. I think that's always helped me to create a very nice balance, and also to remind me, to motivate me more. So, for example, how I can afford going from a V8 to like a V12, then I have to do well at work, So like, like those sort of things. But it's like I get along, and I do photography. I am into like cinematography too. I love to capture things.
Do you hack on cars the same way as you hacked on hardware and software?
I would say yeah, definitely. I need to be more intentional about it, but definitely I do. I'm not. It's been a while. I got my hands dirty, but I mostly do. I mean, when you have some very interesting performance machines around you, you obviously are forced to understand how it works. Because it could be a liability at some point. So, but the math in my head is emotional support. So yeah, so that's how I look at it, right? So yeah.
I understand. I mean, I did buy a sports car, but I think that's the windows of cars, in the sense that, how newer cars are, you open up the hood and everything is almost covered in plastic and you can barely see the engine under it. And the whole thing is ran by a mystical computer that you don't have access to. You don't know what code is running on it. So I will not tell my little baby that I just called her Windows. But but yeah, I definitely did talk to people. Like they just see the car and they're like, "Oh, let me tell you about what I'm building at home and how it would just, like beat your car." And
car, yeah. exactly.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I've heard some guys with really crazy, like, this is what I did to the engine, and then, you know, I left whatever dude standing in the race, and then no one wants to race me anymore. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, no,
I
it's
just
fun.
came here to pump gas, man. Like,
Yeah, it's a very interesting culture. I find it very, very interesting, to be fair. Yeah.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you